So this video is probably going to seem a little discombobulated. It's the last video in the bear series, but I stopped working on the bear. Well, the last video for the bear came out in September of 2018, so this is kind of 8 months worth of footage of carving it, and the process of adding the fur is very repetitive, so I didn't film a ton of that. But this is doing the paw, and I made this obviously separately from the bear. It was just easier because the feet, the paw, and the hands had different detail, so it was easier to do them off the bear. So I laminated some cedar and some pressure treated wood together, and then carved this. That angle I got using just a bevel gauge with a digital gauge on it, so I could get the angle for the paw. And this I did in the beginning, towards the end of the fall. It just looked really weird without a paw up there, so I did do this, even though from pretty much the end of October through, I would say, March, I didn't work on the bear pretty much at all. And for anyone that hasn't seen the other videos, or for anyone that cares, this was a project I started last summer. It was the end of June, beginning of July, and that is because the second side of my shop used to be just storage, and I needed more room for tools because the business was expanding. I cleaned out the whole shop, but I had a ton of lumber to get rid of, and the best way to get rid of it was I decided to make this sculpture outside my shop. So the whole thing is just made up of scrap pieces of old projects.
I have kind of rough cutting out that paw and mocking it up on the arm. I haven't really worked on this bear that much in at least the past month. It's partially been because the past month, I would say at least 80% of the days have been rainy and or overcast and damp, and the tools just get gunked up really quick when this is wet. So I haven't been working on it, and to couple that with fall being by far my busiest time of the year. I think the last time I filmed, I spoke about the fact that as much as I like my texture, I don't think it's deep enough to create the sort of depth I want. So I started working on this side, honestly, probably a couple weeks ago, and you could see what I'm talking about here with my cuts have gone much deeper, and it creates more depth. See, in this portion, this is actually almost undercutted, so it looks like it's a flap laying on top of another piece, and that's kind of the look I want to go for from here on out. I left out this one leg, and you could already tell the difference in the depth. It just creates so much more depth of texture when you go for a deeper cut, versus how, even though aesthetically I like how this looks, it doesn't create as much depth. It doesn't look like thick fur. So the technique after this is pretty simple. I'm still making these thick triangles. I'm just going deeper into the wood to make them. I'm also feathering out the top a little bit. I'm not keeping them totally square. You could see where I've hit them, because once you put the texture on, it will make it look like this is being layered behind these ones, even though they're all still on the same plane. So now I could go through and put that middle piece I've been putting on with my die grinder, and then do the same thing with the Dremel. And I'll probably film this technique, because since it changed slightly, when I have a better angle, which will probably be higher up, like the belly or something. It's just easier to film with the camera at that point. So I did this leg on the depth I want. I actually just started roughing out the belly yesterday, and you could see how it looks much better the deeper I go. And you can especially see that transition on the leg I've been working on over here to where the original texture was. It's the end of October, and I was kind of putting this off a little bit because it's been so unseasonably warm, and now it's unseasonably cold, and I've been reminded of the fact that as soon as it starts to rain and freeze, ice and stuff and all these cracks, which I'm going to end up filling, is going to create a mess. So now I'm kind of in a time crunch to get this done. I'm hoping to have the legs and that part of the belly completely done by the end of the week. That's not a super ridiculous timeline. I think it'll be easy to do. Ideally, I gotta even get a little bit further, and then after that, when I'm up to standing height, I think is when I'm going to refilm how I'm doing the texture. It's similar, but it's a little different.
So this is the new process I was talking about with the legs, and basically with the carving bar, I just made initial deeper deeper cuts than what I did when I first started doing this. And then I kind of feathered the edges when I could with the saw towards the back of it, and the edges, you just couldn't get the right angle. And then I had that dovetailing bit in the die grinder, and that really feathered out the triangles. And then I got a new, it's a pointed rough bit for the die grinder, and then I was able to add that detail. And the last step with the pointed bit, there's the dovetailing bit doing that center mark, and then that pointed bit, I also feather the edges so that it looks like they're laying on top of each other. And the die grinder really saved a ton of time versus using the Dremel. So for most of the rest of this, it was really just a process of repeating this pattern.
A lifesaver on the bear project, now that I started it up again, were they're safety glasses, but they're almost like goggles. I've tried goggles before and they fog up a ton. These actually have enough play in the space between the foam and your face where they will fog up, but not as bad as goggles. And that just helped a lot. Last summer when I was carving that bear, I was constantly getting wood chips in my eyes, even with safety glasses on, and even with the helmet with the shield. And I wear contacts, and it just really irritated my eyes. This time around, these were a lifesaver, and in fact, I use them a lot of times when sanding in general. They just keep so much fine dust out. I got these off of Amazon. This is the brand. I'm not necessarily endorsing this brand. This is just the one that I bought. And there were much more higher end versions of these, which probably work a lot better. But the way that I like to shop in general is I try and buy the best product that doesn't break the bank. I mean, you could probably spend 50 or 60 bucks on a pair of these. I think these were like $10.
So then I finally got around to doing the second paw, and it was the same process as the first paw. I just laminated some wood together, and then I screwed it to a plank and was able to carve it in my shop. With my door open, I don't have to worry about fumes or anything like that. So same process, I used the saw to rough everything out, and then the other tools to get all the detailing. So once this paw went into place, it was starting to look really good. And it was funny because everyone in town was really likes the bear, and it was people thought it was done this last fall, and I had to keep telling people that no, it wasn't done yet. I'm only carved about halfway through. So that this last push I had, I finished this faster than I thought I was going to, which was just nice. I honestly thought I was going to get past the year mark. I wanted to get it done in a year, and I ended up going quicker than that. So you weren't actually going to see the open part of the paw on the one side, but I did put all the detail carving into it just so it would look more natural. And for peace of mind, I knew it was going to be there even though you couldn't really see it. You'd be seeing that back edge. And then attaching the extremities were easy. I just used, I think, like 1.5-inch dowel. So I would drill a hole into part of the paw and then part of the bear, put that dowel in there, and then glue everything in place and not have to worry about it moving around on me over time. So then this was the last final push. When I got to the arm, to the neck, the head was going to be a little different. I wasn't going to put as thick a detailing on it, so most of it was doing the nose, the mouth, and the eyes, and the head was more formed than I thought. When I got up on the ladder, it really didn't need a lot of finished carving in there. So for the mouth, I wanted the bear smiling, and I knew it wasn't going to be a realistic smile. I wanted it to be exaggerated, almost like a caricature. So it was just a lot of being up on a ladder with a Dremel, carving a mouth and carving teeth, and then doing the head. I started to use that die grinder to do fur, and it just wasn't really working, so I ended up using the carving bar on the chainsaw and just making really rough cuts on the whole head. Gave me a nice fur-like texture. That other pattern I was using on the body just wouldn't have looked natural if I had transferred that to the head. And getting the shots on the head were tough. I didn't have a tripod tall enough to get really close, and The way the sun is in the sky by where I live, it kind of hits a tree in the garage, and was always a weird glare, so I can only get it from certain angles. So then once I had the carving done, I washed it and I used a deck cleaner on the bear. You could see just how the different tones in it. The midriff is where the water coming down the arm really started to collect mold, and you could see that it's coloring differently. So then this is adding the tail, same process. I just drilled a hole and then a laminated block went in there, and when that was dry I went back and carved it. So in order to make all that detail I had on the bear pop, I knew this whole time I wanted to torch it. And someone had given me this pretty powerful torch that actually connects to a larger propane tank, a 20 pound propane tank. So the torching went pretty fast. It was a terrifying process because there's so many holes in the bear that the smoke would naturally go through the holes and then come out in other parts of the bear. So in the beginning I constantly thought I was catching the whole thing on fire, but you can't see it super well in the video. I had a fire extinguisher right next to me as well as a hose. So if worse came to worse, I could have prevented any catastrophes, but this was a terrifying process. It also made me appreciate roofers much more, because even though it wasn't super hot out, using a flame like that in the summer is just uncomfortable. So towards the roof, I put a piece of metal up there so I didn't char anything or catch anything. I didn't want to catch anything on fire. And I just went through and did the whole bear like this. And that was when you could, so the char hit the top points of that texture, so you could still see the wood, natural wood underneath, but it created such a great sense of depth as soon as you started to put that char on there. And also the coloring was better. It started to look more like a bear. So at certain points I used a smaller propane tank. And I have the teeth and the eyes painted in this video mostly so that people could see them from the street as I was working, but with the char and staining and everything I ended up repainting all of those multiple times. And you could see it well in this shot. The texture on the extended arm was my least favorite spot, and that was mainly because since the lumber there is so thin and I wrapped it around that armature so the arm's hollow, I didn't have a lot of depth as I did in the belly to get it. So the arm is where it looks the least natural, but the nice thing about torching everything was it evened out all of the coloring and all of the differences in the wood, and it kind of pulled everything together as well as making the fur look much more realistic. So then this is repainting all of the parts, which I ended up having to do it again after I applied stain. And the eyes are bigger than they would be on a bear. Bear eyes are pretty small, so I made them bigger so that you could actually see them when you're walking past. And then redoing the teeth as well. So filming behind the bear is tough. There's not a lot of good angles and I naturally block them, but the tail was pretty easy. I just took that block and rounded it over and then roughed it up a little bit and torched that as well, and then it matched the rest of the piece pretty well. So then the final finish, I hit the jackpot at Lowe's last fall. They had all of their pre-mixed outdoor stains for decking on sale, and I got a 50-gallon container of stain on sale for like 20 bucks. So I bought it and it's just been sitting in my shop. So I sprayed the whole thing with this decking stain, and that's just to protect it. This is pretty ephemeral as far as work goes. It's not going to last forever, especially with all those holes, and then it's exposed to the elements. But the stain will really help extend that period. This was supposed to be almost a translucent stain. I didn't think it was going to be as dark as it turned out. On the can, this little swatch, it's definitely darker on the bear, and maybe that's because the wood was already a little weathered. I ended up liking it, but this was darker than I thought it was going to be. You could see in the final photos how much that stain really darkened up the whole thing, but now it looks more like a cohesive piece when it's all one color.
So this is that finished bear. It's actually done earlier than I thought it was going to be. I wanted to get it done within a year, which I did, but I ended up getting it done before Memorial Day, which was kind of nice. In general, I'm happy with it. There's definitely things I would change, which some of them I've mentioned in the video. The only other thing I really have left to do is, and you could see I've been doing it here, is I've been filling the holes. They sell roofing tar in a caulk tube. You can't really tell it's there, but it will keep bugs from making holes in there and will keep water out. But for the purposes of this video, this is pretty much done. You can see over here I have it done, and those are kind of what the holes look like. You can also see in the back I added a tail. As far as the actual rendering of it, I'm fairly happy, especially for my first time. The proportions are pretty good. People can obviously tell that it's a bear. It's still, and I've mentioned this in older photos, a little bit fat for how tall it is, but not in the sense that it looks odd. If I was to change something, that would probably be the one thing I would have changed, was make it a little bit taller. I started to run out of room to carve because you can see that I was breaking through in certain spots, so I had to kind of stop cutting in certain spots, and that's why it ended up kind of stocky. Also, the other huge problem was the nails. I just kept hitting them, so basically all the tools that I used, like all the chain I got, is pretty much nicked. It's always nice to have a garbage chain, but I ended up going through a fair amount of chain, and like for example the grinders I used, I ended up getting, I don't know if I mentioned this in any of the videos, I ended up getting one of these die grinders to make my life a heck of a lot easier, and it really did. But you could see those bits, like they're just missing teeth, and the teeth that are on there have been knocked down. So it could be a very expensive project as far as tools. Like I said, I could use this for other things, but for most circumstances this is now garbage. And I had one of these medium discs in here, same problem. A lot of the teeth have been hit or knocked down. This one still works pretty well. But once again, that was kind of a huge deterrent to whether or not I would do this style again. The screws, they just need to be placed better. The other huge problem I had, and you could kind of see it in this one spot, is the plywood just does not want to be chainsawed, does not want to be carved. I knew that was going to be an issue, but I have a lot of plywood scrap. In order for this to be made, pretty much, it's funny to say I would change it because it had to be made the way I made it, or I would have had to probably spend another year saving up wood and throwing out a lot more. But the plywood just really chipped off, and it wasn't easy to grind into because it's laminated perpendicularly, so you're always kind of going into edge grain at some point. It just didn't like a lot of the processes. The parts where I had 2x4s and pine were substantially easier to carve in general. I did use particle board and MDF in a couple spots, and I would definitely not use that again. That stuff just kind of nicked off. It didn't take color well, it didn't carve well at all. But the other problem was, since you're going through multiple layers, as you would go from pine to some hardwood to plywood, it's just all the tools reacted differently on each part, and that made carving it pretty difficult. And the other big critique would be the pattern on the legs is much nicer than the pattern as I got further along. Especially on the arm, you could tell I really just started to get into triangle swatches. I was just getting really exhausted with carving this. It was very repetitive, tedious process, especially as you got higher up and you were on a ladder. It just never feel super safe using a chainsaw on a ladder. So the legs do look a little bit better, and it gets gradually less fur looking the higher up you get. So that's pretty much the bulk of the little changes I would make. I mean, like I said, in general, I'm pretty happy with it. It's also become fairly popular in town, and people that didn't make something or aren't makers usually don't notice these little things that you will nitpick on your own projects anyway. So that is pretty much the final end of this series. I'm probably going to go back through all 6 videos and make a shorter version of this now that it's done, but I'll probably post that midweek instead of on the weekend.